On a crisp autumn morning in October 1944, Sergeant Thomas Red McKenna crouched behind his Sherman tank somewhere in the forests of eastern France, staring at a tangle of communication wire that a supply clerk had accidentally dumped near his position. The wire was supposed to go to a signals unit 3 miles back, but a wrong turn and a broken axle had left 200 pounds of copper-wrapped cable sitting uselessly in the mud. McKenna had no idea that within 72 hours, that same useless wire would transform his armored company into the most effective tank-hunting unit on the Western Front. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What began as a frustrated mechanic's improvisation would spread through American armored divisions like wildfire, turning the tide of countless engagements and proving that sometimes the most revolutionary military innovations come not from generals or engineers, but from exhausted men who simply refuse to accept the limitations they had been given. This is the story of how a simple wire trick transformed the Sherman from an underdog into a predator. To understand why McKenna's discovery mattered so much, we need to step back and examine the situation American tank crews faced in the autumn of 1944. The Sherman tank, officially designated the M4, was the backbone of Allied armored forces. American factories had produced over 49,000 of them by that point, with plants in Detroit, Michigan, and other industrial centers working around the clock. The Sherman was reliable, relatively easy to maintain, and could be transported across the Atlantic in enormous numbers. But the Sherman had a problem that every crew knew intimately. Its main armament, the 75mm cannon on most variants, struggled against the heavy armor of German tanks. The Panzer Mark VI, commonly called the Tiger, carried frontal armor over 100mm thick. At typical engagement ranges, a Sherman's shell would often bounce harmlessly off that steel plate, while the Tiger's 88mm cannon could penetrate a Sherman from distances exceeding 1,000 meters. Staff Sergeant William "Billy" Torres, a tank commander from New Mexico, who would later play a crucial role in spreading McKenna's innovation, described the psychological impact in a letter to his brother. "Every time we rolled into a village or a tree line," Torres wrote, "we knew that if there was a heavy German tank waiting, we might not make it out. We had speed and numbers on our side, but when you're inside 30 tons of steel and you know the enemy can punch through you like paper, speed doesn't feel like much comfort." The American military had developed tactics to compensate for this imbalance. Sherman crews were trained to work in groups, using flanking maneuvers to target the thinner side and rear armor of German heavy tanks. They were taught to use terrain, to fight from hull-down positions, to coordinate with infantry and aircraft. These tactics worked, but they required favorable conditions that weren't always available in the dense forests and narrow roads of France and Belgium. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Morrison, commanding the armored battalion that included McKenna's company, had been wrestling with this challenge for weeks. His after-action reports from September 1944 documented a troubling pattern. In open terrain, his tanks performed adequately. But in the forests and villages where much of the fighting occurred, German armored units were inflicting disproportionate losses. Morrison estimated that for every German heavy tank his battalion disabled, he was losing 3 to 4 Shermans. "The mathematics of attrition were against us," Morrison later wrote in his memoirs. "We could absorb the losses because of our production capacity, but I was losing experienced crews faster than replacements could gain the necessary skills." Something had to change. That change began on October 12, 1944, in a muddy forest clearing about 40 kilometers east of Nancy. McKenna's tank, nicknamed Lucky Lady by its crew, despite a notable lack of actual luck, had thrown a track during a routine patrol. While his driver, Private First Class Roberto Dominguez, worked on the repair, McKenna wandered over to examine the pile of communication wire that had been abandoned near their position the previous day. McKenna was not a trained engineer. Before the conflict, he had worked as an automobile mechanic in Cleveland, Ohio, specializing in electrical systems. He had enlisted in 1942 after his younger brother was listed as missing following the fall of the Philippines. The skills he brought to the army were practical rather than theoretical, honed by years of solving problems with whatever materials happened to be available. "I was just looking at that wire," McKenna recalled in a 1972 interview, "and thinking about how we were always having problems with our communication equipment. The SCR 508 radios we used were temperamental, especially the antennas. They'd get knocked off by branches, bent by debris, damaged in a dozen different ways." The standard radio antenna on a Sherman was a simple whip design, effective but vulnerable. In forest fighting, crews often found their communications degraded or eliminated entirely because of antenna damage. This communication breakdown was more than an inconvenience. It meant that tanks operating in close terrain couldn't coordinate effectively, couldn't call for support, couldn't warn each other of threats. McKenna had an idea. What if he could create a more robust antenna system using the communication wire? He spent the next several hours experimenting, wrapping wire around the existing antenna mount, extending a secondary antenna along the turret, creating what he later called a spider web of copper. The results were immediate and unexpected. Not only did the improvised antenna system prove more resistant to damage, but the signal strength increased dramatically. McKenna's tank could suddenly communicate clearly with units that had previously been at the edge of radio range. But that wasn't the discovery that would change everything. That came the next morning, when McKenna's crew encountered a German armored patrol near the village of Chambry. The engagement began badly. McKenna's Sherman was caught in a narrow lane between two farmhouses when a German tank appeared at the far end of the street, approximately 400 meters away. Standard doctrine called for immediate evasive action, trying to find cover or angle for a flank shot. But the lane was too narrow to turn, and reversing would take precious seconds they didn't have. Dominguez, acting on instinct, gunned the engine forward instead of back. Gunner Corporal James "Jimmy" O'Brien traversed the turret and began firing, not expecting to penetrate but hoping to force the German crew to button up and perhaps spoil their aim. What happened next defied everything the American crews had been taught. O'Brien's second round struck the German tank's turret and penetrated. The German vehicle stopped, and after a long moment, hatches opened and the crew emerged to surrender. "We sat there in shock," McKenna remembered. Jimmy kept asking if he'd hit an ammunition storage or something, if the tank had already been damaged. Because there was no way at all that a standard 75mm round had just gone through the front of that tank. But it had, and when McKenna's crew later examined their unexpected prize, they discovered why. The German tank wasn't a Tiger. It was a Panzer Mark IV, a medium tank with considerably less armor. In the stress of combat, they had misidentified it. This might seem like a simple case of mistaken identity, but it illuminated something crucial. The American crews had become so conditioned to fear German armor that they were often hesitant to engage even when the odds were actually favorable. The psychological impact of facing German heavy tanks had created a defensive mindset that affected their performance against all German armor. McKenna reported the engagement to Lieutenant Morrison, including his observations about the identification error. Morrison, intrigued, began investigating similar reports from other units. What he found was striking. In a significant percentage of cases where American tanks had disengaged or retreated from German armor, the enemy vehicles had later proved to be lighter models that the Shermans could have engaged successfully. "We were defeating ourselves before the Germans even fired," Morrison wrote. "Our crews needed better intelligence, faster identification, and more confidence." This was where McKenna's wire antenna came back into the story. The improved communication system he had improvised allowed for something that hadn't been possible before: real-time intelligence sharing between tanks in close terrain. Morrison ordered McKenna to demonstrate his antenna modification to the battalion's other tank commanders. Within 48 hours, 17 Shermans had been equipped with similar systems. The effect on communication range and clarity was confirmed, but Morrison wanted more. "Sergeant McKenna," Morrison told him, according to multiple witnesses, "you've got a talent for improvisation. I'm giving you 3 days and whatever materials you need. Find me more ways to help these crews." McKenna assembled an informal team that included Dominguez, whose mechanical skills matched McKenna's own, Technical Sergeant Patricia "Pat" Holloway from the maintenance company, and surprisingly, a German-American soldier named Private Werner Kaufmann, who had grown up in Pennsylvania but whose parents had emigrated from Bavaria in 1923. Kaufmann's contribution would prove essential. Though he had never seen a German military vehicle before his deployment, he had an encyclopedic knowledge of German engineering principles learned from his father, who had worked in manufacturing. German engineers think differently about certain problems, Kaufmann explained to the group. They prioritize precision and durability. If you understand their philosophy, you can predict their solutions. The team spent the next 72 hours studying captured German equipment, interviewing tank crews about their experiences, and testing various modifications. What emerged wasn't a single innovation, but a system of integrated improvements that would become known informally as the wire trick, because of its origins in McKenna's antenna experiment. The core insight was this: the Sherman's greatest weakness wasn't its armor or its gun. It was the inability of crews to effectively share information in the close terrain where most engagements occurred. German tanks had similar communication limitations, but they compensated with superior optics and a doctrine that emphasized careful positioning and patience. American doctrine relied on mobility and coordination, but that coordination broke down in forests and villages. The wire system addressed this in several ways. First, the improved antennas restored reliable communication in close terrain. Second, McKenna's team developed a simple code system that allowed crews to quickly share targeting information, including rough classifications of enemy vehicles. Third, they created a method for tanks to extend wire connections to infantry units, allowing foot soldiers to relay observations directly to tank commanders. But the most significant innovation was also the simplest. McKenna noticed that tank crews often lost track of friendly vehicles in dense terrain, leading to confusion and sometimes fratricide. His solution was to string thin communication wire between tanks operating in close proximity, creating a physical link that served both as a backup communication line and as a method of maintaining formation awareness. "It sounds ridiculous," McKenna admitted. "We were literally tying our tanks together with string, but it worked. You could feel the wire go taut when your wingmen moved, know which direction they were going, maintain spacing without having to see them." The system had limitations. It only worked at slow speeds and in terrain where the wire wouldn't snag on obstacles. Crews had to be trained to cut the wire quickly if emergency maneuvering became necessary. But in the specific context of forest fighting, where engagements often occurred at ranges under 200 meters and speed was less important than coordination. It provided a decisive advantage. Lieutenant Morrison authorized a field test on October 18, 1944. 8 Shermans, equipped with McKenna's modifications, would accompany an infantry assault on a German-held village suspected of containing enemy armor. The village of Quencourt had been occupied by German forces for 3 days. Intelligence suggested at least 2 enemy armored vehicles were present, possibly more. Previous attempts to dislodge the defenders had failed due to accurate cannon fire from positions the American forces couldn't identify. Captain Elena Vasquez, the infantry commander leading the assault, was skeptical of the tank support. "I'd seen too many situations where the Shermans would hang back, afraid of what might be waiting around the corner," she recalled in a 1985 oral history. "I didn't blame them, but it meant we couldn't count on them when we needed them most." What Vasquez witnessed on October 18th changed her opinion permanently. The 8 modified Shermans advanced into Quencourt in 2 groups of 4, each group connected by McKenna's wire system. Infantry scouts moved ahead, equipped with field telephones that connected to the lead tanks via additional wire lines. When a scout spotted the silhouette of a German tank in a barn at the village's eastern edge, he reported it immediately to Staff Sergeant Torres, commanding the lead Sherman. Torres relayed the information to the other tanks in his group using the code system McKenna's team had developed. Within 30 seconds, all 4 tank commanders knew the enemy's approximate position, the direction its main gun was facing, and the type of cover available for their approach. "In the past," Torres explained, "that kind of coordination would have taken minutes of radio chatter, assuming the radios worked at all. Minutes we usually didn't have." The 4 Shermans performed a coordinated flanking maneuver, 2 tanks holding the German vehicle's attention from the front, while the others worked around to its side. The engagement lasted less than 90 seconds. The German tank was disabled without any American losses, but the real test was still coming. As the infantry advanced through the village, a second German armored vehicle emerged from concealment, attempting to escape to the north. This one was larger, heavier. Torres initially identified it as a Tiger. "I felt my stomach drop," Torres recalled. "Here we go again," I thought. "This is where our luck runs out." But the wire system allowed something that would have been impossible before. Private Kaufmann, acting as a spotter with the infantry, got a clear look at the German tank as it maneuvered between buildings. He immediately reported via field telephone, "Not a Tiger, Mark IV, repeat Mark IV, turret armor is vulnerable." Torres received this information and relayed it to his group within seconds. The psychological effect was immediate. Instead of 4 crews bracing for an engagement they expected to lose, 4 crews recognized an opportunity. The Shermans engaged aggressively. 3 of them scored hits, and the German tank was disabled before it could exit the village. More importantly, the German crew surrendered and confirmed Kaufmann's identification. The tank had indeed been a Panzer Mark IV, one that might have escaped or inflicted casualties if the American crews had hesitated. The coin-court engagement became a turning point. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison immediately requested resources to equip his entire battalion with McKenna's system. He also began documenting the results, compiling statistics that would prove crucial in spreading the innovation to other units. Over the following 3 weeks, from October 19th through November 9th, 1944, Morrison's battalion participated in 23 significant engagements involving enemy armor. The results were remarkable. The battalion's Shermans disabled or captured 89 German tanks, while losing only 12 of their own. The ratio had shifted from 3 to 1 against to more than 7 to 1 in favor. These numbers require context. Not all of the German tanks were heavy Tigers. Many were medium Panzer Mark IVs or even lighter vehicles, but that was precisely the point. Previously, American crews had often engaged these lighter vehicles with the same hesitation they showed against Tigers, giving German tankers time to escape or reposition. The wire system allowed for rapid identification and confident engagement. The statistics also reflected improved coordination. In multiple engagements, McKenna's wire connections allowed Shermans to execute flanking maneuvers in terrain where such tactics would have been impossible without reliable communication. German crews, accustomed to American tanks operating independently in close terrain, found themselves outmaneuvered by coordinated groups that seemed to anticipate their movements. Sergeant Otto Brenner, a German tank commander who surrendered after an engagement near Diers on October 27th, provided valuable perspective in his interrogation. "We knew the American tanks had better numbers," Brenner said through an interpreter, "but we thought we knew how to fight them. Stay concealed, let them come to you, take them one at a time. It had worked before. But something changed. They started moving together, like they could see through walls. We couldn't find isolated targets anymore." Brenner's observation highlighted the fundamental shift that McKenna's system created. German armored doctrine on the Western Front relied on using terrain and concealment to negate American numerical superiority. A single well-positioned German tank could often defeat multiple Shermans by engaging them sequentially before they could coordinate. The wire system broke this pattern by allowing American tanks to maintain coordination even when visual contact was lost. Word of the innovation spread through official and unofficial channels. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's after-action reports were forwarded up the chain of command, where they attracted the attention of Brigadier General James Thornton, who commanded an armored division operating in the same sector. Thornton requested a demonstration, and on October 30th, McKenna found himself explaining his stupid wire trick to a general. "I kept apologizing for how primitive it looked," McKenna remembered. "All these copper cables and field telephone lines rigged up with tape and whatever else we could find. I thought he'd laugh us out of the room." Instead, Thornton asked detailed questions for over 2 hours. He wanted to understand not just the technical aspects, but the tactical implications. How did the system affect crew morale? What were its limitations? How quickly could it be deployed? What training did crews need? By the end of the meeting, Thornton had ordered his entire division to begin implementing McKenna's system. He also did something that would have significant consequences. He wrote a personal letter to General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, describing the innovation and its results. Bradley's response was characteristically practical. He didn't immediately order army-wide adoption, recognizing that the system might not be appropriate for all situations. But he authorized Thornton to establish a training program and dispatched observers to document the results systematically. The training program, established at a rear area facility near Verdun, began operations on November 5, 1944. McKenna was promoted to technical sergeant and assigned as the lead instructor, along with members of his original team. Over the following weeks, they trained crews from 14 different armored units. Technical Sergeant Holloway, the maintenance specialist who had helped develop the system, took charge of producing standardized kits that units could use to modify their vehicles. "We went from improvised wire bundles to actual equipment," Holloway recalled. "Labeled connectors, pre-cut cable lengths, proper insulation. It still looked like a field modification, but it was a professional field modification." The training covered not just the technical aspects of installing the system, but the tactical doctrines that made it effective. McKenna emphasized that the wire was useless without the supporting elements: the code system for rapid information sharing, the infantry liaison procedures, the identification training that helped crews distinguish between different types of German armor. "The wire itself isn't the innovation," McKenna told each class. "The innovation is thinking differently about how tanks fight together. The wire is just the tool that makes that thinking possible." Not everyone embraced the new approach. Some commanders argued that the wire system was too complicated, too dependent on specific conditions, too vulnerable to failure. Major Frank Richardson, commanding an armored battalion that had not yet adopted the system, wrote a critical memorandum arguing that teaching crews to rely on wire connections will degrade their ability to operate independently when conditions prevent wire deployment. Richardson's concerns weren't unreasonable. The wire system did have limitations. It only worked in specific terrain conditions. It required additional time to deploy. It could fail if the connecting wires were severed by debris or enemy action. But the statistical results were difficult to argue with, and most commanders concluded that the benefits outweighed the risks. The system continued to evolve through December 1944 and into 1945. Improvements included better wire materials that were more resistant to breaking, standardized connector systems that allowed quicker setup, and refined tactical doctrines that specified when wire connections were appropriate and when crews should operate independently. Private Werner Kaufmann, who had contributed the insights about German engineering philosophy, developed what became known as the Kaufmann cards, a set of illustrated cards that helped crews quickly identify different types of German vehicles. The cards, produced initially by a printing unit in Nancy and later distributed through official supply channels, became standard equipment in many armored units. The psychological impact of the system extended beyond its tactical effects. Crews who had lived in fear of German armor reported increased confidence after adopting the wire protocols. Staff Sergeant Torres, in his letters home, described the transformation vividly. "Before, every time we rolled out, I felt like we were gambling with our lives. Maybe we'd get lucky, maybe we wouldn't. Now I feel like we have a chance. Not guaranteed survival, nothing is guaranteed, but an honest chance. That changes everything about how you fight." Captain Vasquez, the infantry commander who had witnessed the coin-court engagement, became one of the system's strongest advocates. She worked with McKenna's team to develop improved infantry tank liaison procedures, recognizing that the communication improvements benefited combined operations as well as tank-on-tank engagements. "We'd always known that tanks and infantry were supposed to work together," Vasquez explained. "But the practicalities of communication made it difficult, especially in close terrain. McKenna's system gave us a way to actually do what the manuals said we should be doing." The broader implications of the wire system were recognized even before the end of hostilities in Europe. In February 1945, a team from the Ordnance Department visited units using the system to document the modifications and assess their potential for permanent integration into future tank designs. The team's report, completed in March, recommended that improved communication systems and standardized inter-vehicle connection protocols be incorporated into post-war armored vehicle development. That recommendation would influence the design of tanks for decades to come. The emphasis on communication and coordination that McKenna's improvisation had highlighted became a fundamental principle of American armored doctrine. Modern tanks carry sophisticated communication systems that would have seemed like science fiction in 1944, but the underlying philosophy that effective armor operations depend on information sharing and coordination rather than individual vehicle capabilities traces directly to a muddy forest clearing in eastern France. McKenna himself returned to civilian life after the conclusion of hostilities, going back to his automotive repair work in Cleveland. He rarely discussed his military service, and when he did, he consistently deflected credit to his team and to the crews who had implemented the system under actual combat conditions. "I didn't invent anything," McKenna said in his 1972 interview, one of the few times he spoke publicly about his experiences. "I just noticed a problem and tried to fix it. That's what mechanics do. The real credit belongs to the men who trusted the system enough to use it when their lives were on the line." But history has properly recognized McKenna's contribution. His improvised antenna system and the tactical innovations that followed represented something important about military adaptation: the recognition that frontline soldiers often understand their problems better than distant planners, and that empowering those soldiers to develop solutions can produce results that no amount of centralized engineering could achieve. The 89 German tanks disabled during those 3 weeks in autumn 1944 were not defeated by superior American firepower or armor protection. They were defeated by better information, faster communication, and the confidence that accurate intelligence provides. A tangle of copper wire abandoned by accident in a forest clearing had become the foundation of a tactical revolution. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, who had first recognized the potential of McKenna's innovations, wrote perhaps the most fitting tribute in his post-war memoirs. "We came into that forest believing that our tanks were outmatched, that technology had failed us, that only luck and numbers could see us through. We came out understanding that the most important technology in armored warfare isn't the tank itself. It's the ability of crews to work together, to share what they know, to trust each other. McKenna didn't give us a better tank. He gave us a better way to fight." The story of the stupid wire trick endures because it illustrates a timeless truth about human ingenuity. The most sophisticated weapons and the most carefully planned strategies can be rendered irrelevant by circumstances no one anticipated. When that happens, victory often belongs not to the side with superior resources, but to the side that can adapt most quickly to unexpected challenges. In October 1944, American armored forces faced a challenge that conventional wisdom said they couldn't overcome. The solution came not from generals or engineers, but from a mechanic who looked at a pile of discarded wire and saw possibility instead of waste. That ability to find solutions in unexpected places, to transform problems into opportunities, remains as valuable today as it was 8 decades ago. The crews who survived those engagements carried McKenna's lessons with them for the rest of their lives. Many became engineers, mechanics, managers, and teachers, bringing the same problem-solving mentality to civilian challenges. The wire system itself became obsolete within years, replaced by technologies that McKenna could never have imagined. But the principle it embodied, the belief that ordinary people can solve extraordinary problems if given the freedom and support to try, continues to inspire new generations of innovators. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.